May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. It's funny how if you're really an experienced preacher like I am, you can just sort of look out at the congregation and see in their eyes the questioning and the quest that they have. And I, at least 8 or 10 of you are thinking right now, gosh, I hope he talks about ecclesiology. And you're right. I'm going to talk about ecclesiology. It's an amazing thing. Ecclesiology is the study of the church, like theology is the study of God. And these series of readings that we've had and are going to continue to have for another week or so in Matthew are dealing with how it is that the gospel writer and Jesus sort of understand what the church is about and what we're about and how that's supposed to work. Last week we heard that what we were supposed to do is to not be afraid to sacrifice, not be afraid to take up our cross and to do what it is that we're called to do. One of the tricks about that is to discern what that cross is, what it is that we're called to do. Today, what we hear about is what happens in the context of a community when somebody has been hurt, when there's been that breach in the community, and how you go about mending that breach. Because until that breach is mended, until that hurt can go away and the love can come back, then it's difficult to trust. I believe that these two pieces together are really helpful, both in terms of our own personal understanding of what God asks of us, as well as our corporate understanding. We tend to call that discernment. And one of the things that happens when we are asked to discern, we're asked to try to be honest with ourselves when we're thinking about what it is that God would really have us do. And then in a corporate kind of setting, what we're asked to do is to gather together with other folks and to try to discern what it is that God would have us do. But it's not easy to do that unless the community, or at least the people who are gathered together, trust one another. Without that sense of trust, it's very difficult. And that trust can be broken in many ways. One of the things that happens as we look through the stories in the New Testament, which is very comforting for a broken community, like maybe Grace in the Mountains periodically, because we do not do things perfectly. And so it's nice to know that neither did Jesus' disciples. And so we see that happen again as Jesus speaks to them. Probably the most dramatic example of this damage to the community and what it might mean for a person and the community comes with our Easter story of Thomas. What happens in that particular story is that the community has been devastated by the death of Jesus, but they've gathered together and they're talking and thinking and praying and reflecting. And then there in their midst, Jesus appears. But Thomas isn't with him. When Thomas later joins the community, they tell him, guess what happened? And he says, hey, it's not true. I don't believe you. I don't trust you. I don't trust what you're telling me is true. Until I see with my own eyes, I won't trust you. And I suspect one of the problems is that he wasn't part of that community. A few days later, the community's all gathered together. Thomas is with them, and there into their midst again comes Jesus. And Thomas acknowledges it and understands it because he's again with the community, and his trust is now restored. That little vignette is to remind us of what is so difficult in the midst of the world we're living in right now. in the time of a pandemic. What is so hard is that this is not how Sunday usually looks. Looks pretty nice, but this isn't Sunday. There are people who are not here. There are people who can't be here. There are people who choose not to be here. There are people who, for various reasons, are not part of the community. And that's been going on not just for weeks, but for months. And as that happens, and we find ourselves more distant, it becomes harder to remember and to think, oh, what a great person that I shared coffee with, or a pizza, or we were joking about this or that or the other, or we shared the Eucharist together at the table again and again. In not seeing them then, suddenly it is easy to say, you know, I haven't seen them, and I think they really probably are on the wrong page anyhow, because they may think differently than I think. Now, I know it's hard to believe, but if people think differently than I do, occasionally they could be right. And it's hard, I know it's hard, but it's true. And that's actually true for all of us. What we need desperately, is a community that can come together and can share ideas, to have differences of opinion about what's going to be going on. That's really sort of what a vestry is all about, to come together and to explain to the rector what they really need to do. And then the rector will say, okay, maybe so. We might be able to do that after all. It is important to try to understand how much it means when we can be together and how hard it is when we're not together. Now, we're starting to study right now, just for the next month, creation in terms of celebration. And it is a wonderful thing to do, to celebrate that season. You know, this was made for me years ago by kids. Got butterflies on the other side. You know, creation is a neat and wonderful thing. Unfortunately, in most years, and in this year also, along with this creation times, comes another time called election time. And it's hard. It's very difficult for many of us, because this is a time that it seems like there are people on one side or another side, and they have difficulty talking together. They have difficulty trusting that this person could maybe be right in one way and this person right in another way. And as a community, one of the things that the church is so, I believe, so vital in terms of its role in the community is to model how we can be diverse and think differently and yet be able to come together in order to do what it is that's best for the community, that's best for what we believe God's will is. So the challenge for us is to somehow be able, even in the midst of being separate, to somehow remember that we are all a body, all called to do God's work, all searching for God's will, even though sometimes it's difficult. One of the tasks I have for you that I'd like to ask is that in the coming week, somehow in the coming week, think of someone who is part of this community who you have not seen or spoken to in the last number of weeks or maybe months. Call them. Tell them you miss them. Tell them you're sorry you haven't seen them. Tell them you care about them. Ask how they're doing. Try to build that community again. Because without a community, it's very difficult to know what it is that God would have us do corporately. Because as the reading ends, we know that love's important. And we know that whenever 2 or 3 or 50 are gathered in God's name, and we really are seeking God's will, that God will help us find that God will come into the midst of that. The same thing is true of our world. The same thing is true of our election. The same thing is true of all number of things. We need to honestly listen to and not condemn someone because they think differently, but ask why they might and how that might help us in the way in which we think. I know it's heavy, so let me give you a good example of how it could work for me. I don't believe that we ought to be playing, and it's hard, college football. I think it's a wrong thing to do. I'm very concerned about it. But next Saturday at 7:30 on ESPN, Clemson is playing, and I urge you all to tune in and pull for the Tigers. And you see, I can really understand that they shouldn't be doing it, but I'm going to go along with it. What I hope that we'll be able to do is to find a way to continue to reach out to each other and to reach out beyond just this tent, but to the community, and to invite those people, if they can't be with us physically, at least to be with us prayerfully and spiritually, as we as a community attempt to model and discern what is God's will for us this fall, this creation season, this election season, this pandemic time. And I am convinced if we ask prayerfully, if we ask lovingly the advice of one another, God will help us find the answer that we need at this time.